If you sell an item, whatever it may be, a commodity, to your fellow, or you purchase it, you buy it from your fellow, al tonu ish es ochiv. You should not aggrieve. We'll see what this means. Your fellow. So, very interesting. Here we're speaking about overcharging when you sell, where the seller overcharges the buyer, or the buyer buys where the seller mistakenly sells something below market cost, mistakenly. Meaning the buyer knows the seller is unaware of the market price, and the buyer buys it for less than the market price. It's a Torah violation. The seller is not permitted to sell it for more than the market price, and the buyer is not permitted to buy it for less than the market price. Meaning like this: if I own something which is worth a penny, a cup, the cup is worth a dime, and I say the cup, if you want the cup, it's going to cost you $10, 100% permitted. Because I say, if you want my cup, that's what it costs. We're speaking in a situation where the seller tells the buyer that what he's selling him for whatever price may be, that is the market price. In reality, it's above the market price. So because the seller is taking money for the item he's selling for more than the market price, the additional amount of money he's taking is considered stealing. You're stealing because you have no right. The only reason why the buyer is paying more than market price is because he believes that's the market price. It's like somebody says, I'm giving you the best deal in your life. And he's charging him above the market price. Now, what's market price? Market price doesn't mean the cheapest you can buy it on the market. It means the highest level in market, you charge above that market price. Right? There's a certain spread, and above that, that's above market price. So if you charge, the seller sells it above that, he's in violation of this negative commandment. Lo sonu samiso. You're taking something that you have no right to take. What about if the buyer knows he's buying less than the market price? Then the lowest amount of money which it's sold on the market, and the seller is not aware that he's selling it below the market price, he's out of touch, the buyer is in violation of what? Of buying it for less because he's aware. He's taking something from the seller where the seller is unaware that he's selling it so cheap. And he says, and he tells him it's too much because it's above market. I want it for less. And he's only agreeable because he convinces the seller it's because it's within the range of market price. But in reality, it's below market price. So we'll discuss this in a moment. So this is the law. If a person steals less than a shavat pruta, which we'll discuss today, whatever pruta is a denomination of coin, which is a value, but it's a value. You steal less than a shavat pruta. The Torah says there's a Torah violation, prohibition to steal. What's stealing? If you take anything from your fellow, even if it's less than a cent, did you violate the law of stealing? So the halacha is, the law is, you stole. You stole. Do you have an obligation? The Torah tells us if you steal, you must return the stolen item to the person who you had stolen from. It's a mitzvah saseh. The Torah says, Vehishva gzeil shegozal. You must return the stolen item which you had stolen. Positive commandment. What about a person steals and the one who is victimized waives the obligation to return the stolen item? You have no obligation to return what you stole. Because the basis to return is because you have something which belongs to someone else. But if he waives that obligation, he says it's okay, you have no obligation to return it. So the Gemara tells us that if you steal poch mishavet pruta, you steal something that's less than a cent, you have no obligation to return it, because we could say that if a person was victimized, somebody had taken something less than a cent, we could say it's a presumption that the average person waives that. And because he waives it, you have no obligation to return it. But if you steal something which is a pruta or more, you have no obligation to return it. But if it's poch mishav a pruta, it's less than a pruta, you have no obligation to return it. Now, what about in a transaction? You buy something, the seller sells something above market value, even as much as a cent. Does the seller have to reimburse the buyer for the overcharge, which is a penny? So Chazal said they made an evaluation of the mindset of buyers and sellers, that as long as the overcharge is less than a sixth of the value of the object, the buyer is agreeable to let that go, because it's still less than the sixth. But if the overcharge from a sixth, the sale is a valid sale, but the seller has to reimburse the buyer for that sixth overcharge, the total overcharge. If he overcharges him more than a sixth, then the sale is not a valid sale. Why? Because a person, factually he's duped. The person was misled. He was convinced by the seller, that was the price. Less than the sixth, he says it's okay, I'll let it go. A sixth, it's something which is significant in terms of the total value. He's not letting that go, but he doesn't feel he was duped to that degree that he doesn't want to buy it. So the sale's a sale. He only has to reimburse the buyer for the full amount, the full sixth. What about if the overcharge is more than a sixth? Then the halacha is, the law is, the sale is not valid, because the buyer, to be duped to that degree, says, you know something, I'm not interested in purchasing it. If you misled me to that degree, therefore the sale's not a sale. It goes the other way. If the buyer buys it less than the market price, and the amount which was undersold was less than the sixth, the buyer is able to keep it, and he made that profit. If it's a sixth, he underbought it, he has to pay a sixth to the seller. If he underbought it for more than a sixth, that's the amount of money was sold less, then the sale's not valid, and the buyer has to return the object to the seller, because the seller is not aware that he undersold it to that degree. But in either case, even if you sell it for even a penny above market price value, or even less than a cent, you're in violation of this negative commandment. It's no different than stealing. You steal less than a cent, you violated the law of stealing. However, we say a person lets it go. The same thing, a person is agreeable to let it go if it's less than the sixth. But the seller knowingly overcharges the buyer more than market value, he's in violation of negative commandment. He has no obligation to reimburse the buyer, because the buyer is willing to let it go. Sixth, he's not willing to go. Above a sixth, he's not willing at all to even that the sale should be a valid sale. Okay, that's this law over here. Now, if that's the case, what does it say? V'chisimku mimka labisecha. Labisecha means a person of your nation, meaning a Jew. Lamisecha. So Rashi over here explains. Vod yesh drasha. Minayin she'ata mocher mechor l'Yisrael chavercha. How do we know if you have a choice to sell something to a Jew or to a non-Jew? And they're both going to pay the same amount of money. Or even the Chofetz Chaim writes in his work, Avos Chesed, the non-Jew will pay slightly more, but nothing significant. Who should you sell to the Jew or the non-Jew? The law is you should sell it to the Jew, not to the non-Jew. Because that's chisimkur memkar labisecha. The priority in purchasing should be the Jew. The Jew has first rights of refusal. If the Jew's not interested, then you could sell it to the non-Jew. Let's say the terms of payment, with the Jew it's a lot more complicated, with the non-Jew it's less complicated, then the Jew doesn't take priority. We're speaking about basically everything is pretty much equal. The Jew takes priority over the non-Jew. And the same thing with the person who wants to purchase, sell, whatever it is. Now, So there's an interesting halacha, and which the Chofetz Chaim speaks about in regard to the laws of Lashon Hara. There used to be a bad habit. Today when you buy something, there's a set price. You go to a store, the item is tagged, it costs so much money. But in olden days, when I say olden days, years ago, if you would shop on the Lower East Side and you go into a store, there was a different price for everybody who walked in. You walked in, one person, if the storekeeper saw he couldn't sell it for the first price he asked, because he saw that the buyer was a little bit of a negotiator, so he says, okay, I'll give you a 5%. Give you a 5%. And if he was somebody really a tough buyer, sometimes he'd get a bargain, because the seller wants to sell and the buyer wants to buy, and for the right amount of profit, he's willing to let it go. So very often, this is very important because it brings back memories. You'd walk into a store on Orchard Street, and you go in and you say you want to buy a pair of leather gloves. So the person says it cost you $10 a pair. The person says, it's too much. He says, okay, you have $9. The seller says $9. So he says, I think it's still too much. I'm willing to go down to $8. Nothing less than $8. So what does the buyer do? He walks out of the store. I'm just telling you, this is the way it used to go. It used to work. He walks out of the store, and as he's about to walk out, the seller says, nothing less than $7. $7. Originally he's asking for 10. The man says, 7, too much. And he walks out of the store. And the seller wants to sell this pair of gloves. So he runs down the street after this person. He says, $6, but nothing less than 6. He walks back, and when he pays him, what he puts on the counter? $5. Puts down a $5 bill, and he says, take it or I'm leaving, and don't run after me. He says, okay, I'll take $5. That's the way it used to go. That was the way they used to negotiate. And then after it says, what about tax? He says, I'm paying you cash. I pay cash, I don't pay tax. That's the way it went. And everybody had his price. So what used to happen? Person walks into shul with a new pair of gloves. So his friend says, where did you get it? He says, I just bought it. Where did you buy it? I bought it at this store. He says, what did you pay? He says, I paid $5. $5? If you would have gone to another store, you could have bought it for $3. Yeah, this is the comment his friend says to him. He says, the man overcharged you. He overcharged you. And he's very definite, he overcharged him. When he says that, firstly, what is the value saying he overcharged him? Let's say the amount of money he overcharged him was less than the sixth. Meaning there is no value by making that comment. Why? Because less than the sixth, you're not going to be reimbursed. I'm just telling you the ramifications of this. Less than the sixth, you're not going to be reimbursed. So if you're not going to be reimbursed less than the sixth, what's the point of telling him that he overpaid? If it's a sixth, then it may have value by telling him. Why? Because he go back to the storekeeper and claim the overcharge, which is sixth. And what about if it was more than a sixth? So we said, if you overcharge a person more than a sixth, then the law is that the sale is not a valid sale. So then maybe you will say that it's not Lashon Hara, because it has constructive value. Either it has constructive value because going back to reclaim your sixth, but if it's less than a sixth, it has no constructive value. If it's more than a sixth, it definitely has constructive value because you're going to get beef. The sale is not a sale. So maybe yes. So the Chofetz Chaim says this. We're talking about constants, currency, and commodity. Commodities fluctuate. Something that maybe cost a certain thing on one day, the next day, it costs more because the market fluctuates. See, even though the man who makes the comment says, yesterday I could have bought that for that, just because you could have bought that for that number yesterday, today the price is up, it's higher. So maybe what he paid was within the range of less than a sixth. So you cannot make a comment unless you verify knowing factually what the price is today, because otherwise what you're saying is not constructive value. Because factually, if today the price went up and we charged them is less than a sixth, then the comment you're making is not constructive. It's considered Lashon Hara. Because you're pointing out something negative against the seller, because the seller, you have no claim against him, because if you overcharge it less than a sixth, you're not going to be reimbursed. So what's the point of telling him? Now the Chafetz Chaim says something else, which is based on the Gemara, which eventually we're going to learn in Hazov. In this parak we're studying above Mitzvah. What happens when a person buys something, at the time he's overcharged even more than a sixth, which normally is not a valid sale. Because to be duped more than a sixth, the halach is the buyer doesn't want to buy it if that's the degree that he was misled. What happens? The amount of time passes where the buyer, he found out what the true value is, and even so, he kept the item and did not go back to the seller to reclaim his money. There's a concept, a person could go to a tagar, to a person knowing it, what the price is, and although he knew he was overcharged to that degree, the person says, let it go. And he kept the item, and he did not go back to the storekeeper, to the seller to make the claim. The halacha is, the sale's a sale. Initially, we say, when you walk out of the store and you're overcharged to that degree, you have an obligation to reimburse the buyer. But if the amount of time passes where this buyer could have found out the true value, and he realizes he's overcharged more than a sixth, the buyer no longer has a right to claim that his money, a reimbursement, because if he kept it to that point, that means he's letting it go, and he's agreeable, the purchase should go through, even though he's overcharged more than a sixth. So the one who informs the buyer that he was overcharged, unless you know all these facts, you have no right to make a comment. You can't say a word. Because maybe the price may have fluctuated. So maybe yesterday it was less, today it's more. Maybe it's less than a sixth, and even it's a sixth. And maybe the time has passed where the buyer is aware that he was overcharged and he didn't reclaim his money. So if that's the case, in every one of these instances, you have no right to say a word. But he says, unfortunately, people have a bad habit. The first thing they ask when they see something, by the way, what did you pay? And after you say, what did you pay? He says, the first comment is, I could have gotten it cheaper. And he says, where? He says, and what did you pay? He overcharged you. And how much was the overcharge? All these comments that you make, unless you know factually what it is, every detail, you're in the position that you're speaking Lashon Hara. And then he goes to enumerate how many negative commandments and positive commandments you're in violation in each particular context. But it's all based on what this pasuk here, Losonu ishes hamiso, you're not permitted to aggrieve him financially, overcharge him. So unless you know factually and your intent is for constructive value, you're not permitted to say a word. But people have bad habits. Another thing, the rabbi gives his sermon, or you have a scholar in residence, a guest speaker. So one person says to him, so what do you think? What do you think? Do you think it was good? He says, I've heard better. And or whatever, all kinds of comments. What is the value of if it's a question of having him come back and they're taking a poll in the shul, the membership, should he come back as a scholar in residence or not? Or he's there to try out to be the rabbi, and it's a tryout. Okay, everybody's asked their opinion, they have a right to say it. Because there, the comment, positive, negative, has constructive value. But if it's scholar in residence, it's not a question, is he coming back, not. What's the point of discussion? By the way, how did you like it? He's not such a good speaker. The message, I don't think, was a good message. If the message was a message which is contrary to the Torah, then definitely you have a right to make the comment. What he said doesn't conform with Torah perspective. Definitely, you have a right to say it. That's constructive value. But she doesn't say, I don't think, I don't consider him an intellect. Now, everybody right away categorizes people. Every one of these comments is Lashon Hara. And people, unfortunately, not knowing the laws and habitually responding and evaluating in these contexts continuously, unless you study the laws and you know what you're talking about, you just keep quiet. Because when you cross those lines continuously, you're actually in violation of multiple negative and positive commandments. Mark, what